The Ardennes forest in December 1944 was not a battlefield. It was a frozen white grave. A relentless, moist cold seeped into the bones of the men of the 101st Airborne who found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and shrouded in a thick, suffocating fog near the strategic crossroads of Bastogne. They had been rushed into the line to plug a catastrophic breach, arriving with little more than the uniforms on their backs and a thin layer of optimism. That optimism had frozen solid within days. The world had narrowed to a shivering existence in shallow, waterlogged foxholes scraped from the iron-hard earth. Rations were cut, ammunition was counted by the bullet, and medical supplies were a fading memory. Through the eerie, muffled silence, broken only by the cough of the wind and the distant random crump of German artillery, the mail call, as the paratroopers grimly called it, hung the unspoken question, how long could they hold? In the center of this shrinking perimeter, near the hamlet of Bastogne, Staff Sergeant William Bill Carter, a squad leader in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, tried to keep the spark of defiance alive in his exhausted men. His face, young but hardened beyond its years, was chapped raw by the wind. His breath crystallized in the air as he moved from hole to hole, checking on his boys, sharing a sarcastic joke, and ensuring their few remaining machine guns had clear fields of fire across the snow-blanketed fields. They were all veterans of Normandy and Holland, but this was different. This was a slow, grinding attrition by cold and steel, where the enemy you couldn't see was as deadly as the one you could. Carter's platoon was stretched perilously thin across a wooded rise. Intelligence was non-existent. The fog and the dense pines turned every shadow into a potential German infiltrator. The men subsisted on frozen K-rations and melted snow, their woolen uniforms stiff with ice. They knew the Germans were out there, probing, waiting. The uneasy quiet was worse than the fighting. It was the sound of the trap being set. Late on the afternoon of December 22nd, a sudden furious barrage of mortar and artillery fire slammed into their sector, shaking the frozen ground. It was heavier, more concentrated than the usual harassing fire. When the smoke and snow settled, the outpost in a forward house farm had gone silent. A patrol sent to investigate didn't return. As dusk fell, Carter, peering through his binoculars, felt a cold deeper than the winter chill. Movement, shadows flitting between the distant tree lines. Not just patrols, shapes of infantry and the distinctive low profiles of German armor, panzers, ghosting through the twilight mist. They weren't just probing anymore. They were marshalling. He reported it up the chain, but the weary voice on the other end of the field phone could only offer, "Hold at all costs." That night, under a starless sky, Carter gathered his squad leaders. His orders were simple: dig deeper, stay awake, and prepare. The big push was coming at dawn. What he didn't tell them, what the command didn't yet realize, was that the German plan wasn't a broad assault. Reconnaissance by a terrified, fleeing Belgian civilian who stumbled into their lines hinted at something more precise: a sharp, armored knife point aimed not at the main road, but directly at the weakened seam between Carter's position and the unit to his left, a seam held together by little more than hope and barbed wire. The Germans weren't just coming. They already knew the weakest link, and they were coming right for it.
Dawn on December 23rd did not break. It simply bled into a thicker, more impenetrable gray. A freezing fog, dense and choking, rolled in from the nearby forests, swallowing the world whole. Visibility dropped to mere yards, transforming the familiar, snow-drifted field into a ghostly, silent maze. Sergeant Carter, sensing the lethal opportunity the weather offered an attacker, doubled the sentries and ordered absolute silence along the line. The cold was now a secondary enemy. The primary one was the unseen danger coiling in the mist. His instincts screamed that this was the day. The pre-dawn bombardment had been a probing finger. Now the fist would follow. Just after first light, a frantic whisper crawled down the trench line. The four-man observation post in a shell-shattered cottage 300 yards forward had missed 2 consecutive radio checks. Carter's stomach turned to ice. He immediately dispatched a 5-man patrol under Corporal Jenkins, his most reliable scout, with orders to link up, assess, and return immediately. No heroics. He watched them vanish into the wall of fog, their shapes melting away within seconds, the sound of their cautious footsteps quickly muffled. For 10 minutes, there was only the tense, muffled silence of the fog. Then, from the direction of the cottage, a sudden vicious staccato roar split the air. The unmistakable, ripping saw sound of German MG-42 machine guns, followed by the sharper cracks of M1 Garands. The firefight was terrifyingly brief, ending with a final, solitary American grenade blast. Then, silence again, deeper and more profound than before. The radio crackled to life with Jenkins' voice, tight with panic and pain. They'd found the OP crew dead. On their return, they'd walked straight into a perfectly laid killing zone. The Germans weren't launching a broad assault. They had stealthily advanced under the fog's cover and established a fortified skirmish line with interlocking machine gun nests in a sunken farm lane that everyone thought was too exposed to use. Now that lane was a fortress. Jenkins and 2 others were pinned down in a shallow drainage ditch. 1 man was dead, another bleeding out. The German fire was so precise and heavy that raising a head meant instant death. They were trapped in a bowl of land, with the German positions on the slightly elevated tree line dominating every inch of their position. Carter, studying his creased map with a flashlight, saw the tactical nightmare unfold. The German move was brilliant and ruthless. The patrol wasn't just caught, it was bait. The MG-42s were positioned to cut down any rescue attempt from the main line. The Germans had created a localized, small-scale trap aiming to inflict casualties and force a larger, desperate reaction that would expose the main American line. Carter radioed for artillery or mortar support, but the fog made observation impossible. Firing blind would risk hitting his own men. The company commander's voice was grim. No support available. They were on their own. Carter now faced an impossible equation: leave his men to die or be captured, or order a rescue mission that would likely turn the ditch into a mass grave. The fog, which had hidden the enemy's advance, now felt like a suffocating shroud, holding the desperate cries of his pinned-down soldiers just out of reach, while the German machine guns, invisible in the mist, waited patiently for their next meal. Back in the company command post, a deeper, fouler hole in the ground, chaos reigned. The company commander, a young captain named Miller, lay against the dirt wall, his face pale as the snow outside. A stray sniper round, penetrating the fog with cruel luck, had found him during his own assessment of the front. A medic worked frantically to stem the bleeding from his shoulder, but the shock and blood loss were pulling him into unconsciousness. As Miller's eyes fluttered, his bloody hand gripped Carter's sleeve. "They're your boys, Bill," he rasped, the authority of rank dissolving into a plea of shared agony. "Get them out. Don't lose the line." With that, command of the shattered company,
and the fate of the pinned patrol fell onto the shoulders of a 24-year-old staff sergeant. The weight was instant and crushing. Radio calls to battalion were met with static and the grim repetition of their situation. No artillery, no reinforcements, hold the line. The German trap was a masterstroke of tactical patience. Every minute, Jenkins' voice on the radio grew weaker, reporting another man bleeding out. The MG-42s fired sporadic, disciplined bursts, not wasting ammunition, just reminding the Americans of their presence. Carter studied the map again, the pencil lines blurring before his tired eyes. A direct assault up the open slope was suicide. A flanking move through the woods would take too long and risk alerting other German units. He had one mortar tube left with 3 precious rounds, but without a visible target, they were useless. Carter called his remaining squad leaders to the CP. Their faces, gaunt and frost-rimed, mirrored his own despair. The options were all bad. Then Private First Class Riley, a quiet soldier from Ohio who had been a geometry teacher, spoke up. He pointed a trembling finger at the map. "They're here, in the lane. Their fire is focused here, on the ditch. But see this small fold in the ground. It's not much, but it runs diagonally across the field toward our left. It's a drainage gully, probably frozen over." He explained a desperate, horrific calculus. If someone could draw the primary German fire away from the ditch, make themselves a bigger, more immediate threat, even for 60 seconds, it might create a narrow, unseen corridor. The men in the ditch could then crawl, not toward their own lines, but laterally along that frozen gully, using its minimal cover to reach the thicker woods on the left flank, completely out of the kill zone. It was a faint chance, but the man who drew the fire would have to walk directly into the open field, in full view, becoming the sole target for every German gun. He would be a walking sacrifice. Carter understood immediately. It was the only move on the board. He looked at his men, these boys he had trained and led from Normandy. He couldn't order any of them to do it. The words of his captain echoed, "They're your boys." The logic was as cold and clear as the Ardennes winter. He was in command. The responsibility and the price was his. He said, "Prep the men in the ditch. Tell Jenkins the new route. On my signal, they move. Do not, under any circumstances, fire to cover me. It will give away their movement." As his stunned men stared, he began unbuckling his gear, leaving only his uniform, his helmet, and a single grenade, not for the Germans, but for himself if he was captured. The decision was made. He would trade his life for a slim chance to save theirs. But as he prepared to step into the fog, a hand grabbed his arm. It was Riley, the former teacher, his eyes wide with an idea more terrifying than the walk into the fire. "Sergeant," he whispered urgently, "they'll expect a soldier. They won't expect a ghost."
Without another word, Riley scrambled to the rear of the CP and returned clutching a mud-stained white bedsheet, loot from a ruined farmhouse. In the faint light, his plan became horrifyingly clear. Carter was to drape it over his shoulders like a ghostly shroud. In the thick fog, against the snow, it might break up his silhouette for a few critical seconds longer than a standard uniform, making him a flickering, uncertain target. It was a desperate gambit rooted in optical illusion, not protection. Carter nodded silently, wrapping the coarse fabric around his torso and helmet. He took a final look at his men, their faces a mosaic of terror and disbelief, then turned and climbed out of the trench. The world narrowed to the crunch of his boots on the frozen crust of snow, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence.
With each step away from the relative safety of the line, the cold air burned his lungs. The fog clung to him, damp and invasive. He focused on a lone skeletal tree in the middle of the field, his predetermined marker. He walked deliberately, not running, making himself a clear, steady target. For 20 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant cry of a crow. Then, from the German line, a sharp, guttural shout of alarm. The fog-muffled world exploded. The first burst from an MG-42 tore into the snow 10 feet to his right, the iconic ripping sound horrifically close. Then another, closer still, stitching a line of geysers that walked towards him. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He kept walking towards the tree, the white sheet now speckled with thrown-up dirt and ice. A rifle bullet snapped past his ear. He was in the heart of the kill zone. Every German gun in the lane was now zeroing in on this single madman walking upright through the field. Tracer rounds, glowing faintly in the fog, began to converge on him, creating a lethal nexus of fire through which he moved like a specter. Back in the ditch, Corporal Jenkins heard the devastating concentration of fire shift away. Peering over the frozen lip, he saw the impossible, a faint white-shrouded figure moving perpendicular to their position, drawing all the thunder and lightning of the German position. It was the signal. "Now! Go, go, go!" he hissed, shoving the wounded man ahead of him. The 3 surviving soldiers began a frantic low crawl along the frozen gully, their movement masked by the cacophony aimed at their sergeant. Carter, meanwhile, had reached the tree. Shards of bark exploded next to his face as a rifle round hit the trunk. He pressed his back against it, the sheet tangling around him. He was pinned. The initial German confusion had solidified into a focused, professional effort to eliminate this threat. He could hear shouted commands in German now, closer than he expected. They were adjusting. He knew he had maybe 30 seconds before a mortar round or a flanking shooter ended it. His mind, crystal clear, calculated the angles. He had to keep their attention a moment longer. He pulled the pin from his single grenade, held it for a 2 count, and then leaned out, hurling it not toward the machine gun, an impossible throw, but in a high arc towards the general area of the shouts. The explosion was dulled by the fog and snow, but the flash and new noise achieved his goal, confirming for the enemy that he was an active, aggressive combatant. As he slumped back behind the tree, a searing hot pain tore through his left calf. He crumpled to one knee, the white sheet darkening instantly with blood. The wound was a clean rifle shot. The bone was intact, but he couldn't run. The mission, however, was accomplished. He saw no movement from the gully. Jenkins and his men were gone, hopefully to the tree line. A strange calm settled over him. He had turned himself into the perfect lure, and the trap had sprung on him alone. The German fire intensified, chewing the tree to pieces. He was out of time, out of options, and now out of luck. As he fumbled with the sheet, trying to staunch the bleeding with a handful of snow, a new sound cut through the din, not the sound of German weapons, but the distinct, deeper-throated report of a Browning .30 caliber machine gun firing from the woods on the left flank. Then another, then the beautiful, heavy thump of a mortar from his own lines. The rescue he hadn't dared to hope for had begun, but it was targeting the German position now revealed by their own muzzle flashes. Carter's sacrifice had not only freed his men, but had finally given his company a target. The frozen field, once a silent trap, was now a roaring battleground, and he was stranded at its center.
While the German fire converged on the ghostly figure by the tree, a desperate, silent drama unfolded in the frozen gully. Corporal Jenkins and his 2 remaining men, one barely conscious and dragged between them, inched their way along the ice-covered ditch. Each metallic scrape of a boot or rasp of a labored breath felt like a scream in the relative quiet of their narrow world. Above them, the air was alive with the roar of battle focused on Carter. Tracer rounds sliced the fog overhead, and the constant ripping hammer of the MG-42s was a grim metronome counting down their sergeant's remaining seconds. Jenkins guided them by touch and memory, the map's contours etched in his mind. The gully began to curve, its banks offering meager inches of additional cover. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of the firefight began to muffle slightly, shifting direction. They had crawled beyond the immediate kill zone. With a final Herculean effort, Jenkins pushed the wounded Nan up over the bank and into the sanctuary of a dense pine thicket. Collapsing into the snow, they allowed themselves a moment of shuddering relief, their bodies trembling from cold, fear, and exertion. But the mission wasn't over. Looking back, Jenkins could still see the flashes in the fog where Carter was pinned. The sergeant had bought their escape, but now he was the one in the trap. The new American fire from the flank was a godsend, but it was sporadic, uncoordinated. Jenkins knew they had to re-establish contact with the main line and direct that fire. Abandoning Carter was not an option. He left the wounded man with the other soldier, whispering, "Stay alive, I'm going for help," and began a low, frantic sprint through the woods, parallel to the American lines, searching for the source of the friendly machine gun fire. Back at the company command post, the tension was unbearable. The men had heard the devastating concentration of fire shift and hold, knowing it was aimed at Carter. Then the beautiful sound of their own mortar and the distant Brownings had erupted. But without eyes on the field, they were firing blind. Just as the acting platoon leader was about to order a suicidal charge to find Carter, a mud-covered, panting figure tumbled into the trench. It was Jenkins. Between gasps, he painted the picture. Carter was down by the tree, wounded but alive minutes ago. He gave the approximate coordinates of the German lane position, now clearly highlighted by their own muzzle flashes. This was the gift Carter had given them, a located, exposed enemy. The platoon leader grabbed the field phone. "Fire mission. Coordinates follow." Within a minute, the remaining mortar tubes coughed, sending high-explosive rounds arcing into the German flank. The .30 cows, now with a defined target, poured sustained fire into the lane. The German ambush force, so confident and methodical moments before, was now caught in a violent reversal. Their focus on the lone soldier had cost them their concealment. Under the sudden, accurate punishment, their fire began to slacken and become disorganized. Seizing the moment, a volunteer squad led by Jenkins himself launched out of the trench, not toward Carter, but on a sharp angle to outflank the lane using the same woods Jenkins had just traversed. Their goal was to suppress the nearest machine gun nest and create a corridor to reach the tree. The battlefield, once a static death trap, was now fluid and chaotic, all because one man had stood up and walked into the fire. Yet as American shells rained down and the flanking squad moved in, the white-shrouded figure by the shattered tree lay motionless in the reddening snow. The cost of the breakout was now written in his still form. The price for the squad's salvation was being paid in full by their sergeant, and the grim accounting of war was not yet complete. While the German fire converged on the ghostly figure by the tree, a desperate, silent drama unfolded in the frozen gully. Corporal Jenkins and his two remaining men, one barely conscious and dragged between them, inched their way along the ice-covered ditch. Each metallic scrape of a boot or rasp of a labored breath felt like a scream in the relative quiet of their narrow world. Above them, the air was alive with the roar of battle focused on Carter. Tracer rounds sliced the fog overhead, and the constant ripping hammer of the MG-42s was a grim metronome counting down their sergeant's remaining seconds. Jenkins guided them by touch and memory, the map's contours etched in his mind. The gully began to curve, its banks offering meager inches of additional cover. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of the firefight began to muffle slightly, shifting direction. They had crawled beyond the immediate kill zone. With a final Herculean effort, Jenkins pushed the wounded Nan up over the bank and into the sanctuary of a dense pine thicket. Collapsing into the snow, they allowed themselves a moment of shuddering relief, their bodies trembling from cold, fear, and exertion. But the mission wasn't over. Looking back, Jenkins could still see the flashes in the fog where Carter was pinned. The sergeant had bought their escape, but now he was the one in the trap. The new American fire from the flank was a godsend, but it was sporadic, uncoordinated. Jenkins knew they had to re-establish contact with the main line and direct that fire. Abandoning Carter was not an option. He left the wounded man with the other soldier, whispering, "Stay alive, I'm going for help," and began a low, frantic sprint through the woods, parallel to the American lines, searching for the source of the friendly machine gun fire. Back at the company command post, the tension was unbearable. The men had heard the devastating concentration of fire shift and hold, knowing it was aimed at Carter. Then the beautiful sound of their own mortar and the distant Brownings had erupted. But without eyes on the field, they were firing blind. Just as the acting platoon leader was about to order a suicidal charge to find Carter, a mud-covered, panting figure tumbled into the trench. It was Jenkins. Between gasps, he painted the picture. Carter was down by the tree, wounded but alive minutes ago. He gave the approximate coordinates of the German lane position, now clearly highlighted by their own muzzle flashes. This was the gift Carter had given them, a located, exposed enemy. The platoon leader grabbed the field phone. "Fire mission, coordinates follow." Within a minute, the remaining mortar tubes coughed, sending high-explosive rounds arcing into the German flank. The .30 cows, now with a defined target, poured sustained fire into the lane. The German ambush force, so confident and methodical moments before, was now caught in a violent reversal. Their focus on the lone soldier had cost them their concealment. Under the sudden, accurate punishment, their fire began to slacken and become disorganized. Seizing the moment, a volunteer squad led by Jenkins himself launched out of the trench, not toward Carter, but on a sharp angle to outflank the lane using the same woods Jenkins had just traversed. Their goal was to suppress the nearest machine gun nest and create a corridor to reach the tree. The battlefield, once a static death trap, was now fluid and chaotic, all because one man had stood up and walked into the fire. Yet as American shells rained down and the flanking squad moved in, the white-shrouded figure by the shattered tree lay motionless in the reddening snow. The cost of the breakout was now written in his still form. The price for the squad's salvation was being paid in full by their sergeant, and the grim accounting of war was not yet complete.
The crude battalion aid station, a chaotic canvas tent, shuddering with each distant artillery impact, smelled of blood, antiseptic, and wet wool. Here, in this flickering island of light and agony, the immediate war for Staff Sergeant Bill Carter shifted from bullets to biology. His shredded leg, now exposed under the glare of a gasoline lantern, told a grim story to the exhausted surgeons. A ragged, through-and-through wound, dirt and fabric ground deep into the flesh by his crawl and the explosion. Shock and blood loss had pulled him into a shallow, feverish unconsciousness. The medics worked with a frantic, tender urgency, fighting the twin enemies of infection and trauma. Plasma dripped into his arm, sulfa powder was packed into the wound, and a more permanent tourniquet was applied. Throughout the long, cold night, Carter drifted in and out, his mind trapped in a loop of the frozen field, the ripping sound of the MG-42s, and the faces of his men. Outside the tent, a quiet line had formed in the snow. Men from his company, their own faces hollow with exhaustion, waited not for orders, but for news. Corporal Jenkins, his own head bandaged, stood as a sentinel, repeating the same phrase to every newcomer who asked. He walked right out there. He saved us all. This wasn't official testimony yet. It was the raw, unfiltered currency of the front line, passed from one soldier to another, already solidifying into the unit's foundational lore. When a weary captain from the regimental staff arrived to take preliminary statements for the after-action report, he didn't find reluctant witnesses. He found a chorus. One after another, the paratroopers, usually cynical and tight-lipped, spoke with a startling clarity about the frozen fog, the trapped patrol, and the impossible moment their sergeant stood up. Private Riley, the former teacher, drew a meticulous diagram in the snow with a stick, explaining the tactical suicide and the geometric chance Carter had created. Their words were simple, unadorned by the language of citations. He gave them a target. He took the heat so we could move. We're here because he's in there. Within days, a concise but powerful summary of the action, built on these unanimous accounts, traveled up the chain of command. It would eventually crystallize into a formal recommendation for the nation's highest honor. But for Carter, awakening to a throbbing leg and the sterile smell of a rear-line hospital, the notion of heroism felt like a foreign, uncomfortable weight. The morphine dreams blurred with reality, leaving him with a searing guilt. Had he moved fast enough? Had everyone from the patrol really made it? The first time Jenkins visited, sitting awkwardly by his cot, Carter's first whispered question was about the wounded man from the ditch. Only upon hearing that all three had survived did some of the tension leave his eyes. The official citation would call his actions conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, but the men who were there used a different vocabulary. It was taking one for the team, the ultimate act of a non-com who saw himself not as a hero, but as a shepherd. As Carter began the long, painful journey of recovery, transferred to hospitals in England and later the United States, the war in the Ardennes reached its climax. The siege of Bastogne was broken, and the 101st moved on. Carter's physical war was over. The shrapnel in his leg and the damage to his muscle ensured he would never jump from an airplane again. He was discharged, not with a parade, but with a sheaf of papers, a pension, and a quiet understanding of the cost. He returned to a country that had moved on from the bulge, to a hometown that greeted him as a quiet man who walked with a slight limp and rarely spoke of December 1944. The medal, when it came, was placed in a drawer. His real reward, the one he carried every day, was the memory of the faces of the men he brought home, and the silent acknowledgement in his own heart that in one frozen moment, trapped in the fog, he had made the only choice a true sergeant could make.
William Carter returned to a world of quiet routine in a small Indiana town, a place untouched by the fog and artillery of the Ardennes. The war hero,
the recipient of the nation's highest honor, became a familiar yet enigmatic figure. The man at the post office with a slight limp, the dependable foreman at the local printing plant, the father who tucked his children in at night, but whose eyes sometimes drifted to the window during winter storms. The Medal of Honor was stored not in a display case, but in a cedar chest alongside his dog tags and a carefully folded, stained bedsheet fragment. He accepted the gratitude of his community with a shy, awkward nod, but deflected any deep discussion. At Legion Hall gatherings, when the stories of the Bulge flowed with bourbon and bravado, he would listen quietly, a faint, unreadable smile on his face, speaking only to correct a minor tactical detail about the terrain near Bastogne, never about his own role. His legacy was not of speeches or pride, but of silent endurance. The physical pain from his leg was a constant, low-grade companion, a personal barometer for cold fronts. The deeper wounds were less visible but more profound. The flinch at sudden, sharp noises, the nightmares of white fields and muffled screams in the fog that would jolt him awake, and the unshakable conviction that the real heroes were the men whose names were on the memorial in the town square, not his own. He lived a good life, a full life by any measure, yet a part of him remained forever in that frozen ditch, not as a hero, but as a sergeant who had simply done his job. The weight of his choice, the cold calculus of one life for many, never left him. It was a quiet, private burden, carried with the same stoicism with which he had once carried his rifle. The official record, in the crisp, formal language of the U.S. Army, immortalized his actions in a citation and a file stored in the National Archives. For decades, his story existed in two parallel streams: the dry, heroic narrative of military historians, and the vivid, emotional memory held by the surviving men of his company. They were the keepers of the true legacy. Every few years, a letter would arrive from Corporal Jenkins, or a Christmas card from Private Riley, their simple greetings always containing the same unspoken message: "We remember. We are here because of you." When Carter passed away peacefully in 1987, it was not front-page news, but his obituary in the local paper triggered a silent avalanche of letters from across the country, from aging men with trembling hands who wrote to his family of a foggy morning and a man in a white sheet. The legacy of Bill Carter and of the thousands of men who stood at Bastogne is not one of glorious victory charges, but of tenacious, desperate holdouts in the freezing dark. It is a legacy defined by the human capacity to withstand unbearable pressure, cold, and fear, and in the most extreme crucible, to choose sacrifice over surrender. The monument to Carter is not made of marble or bronze. It is found in the grandchildren of the men he saved, who exist because of a single, unimaginable walk into fire. His story encapsulates the essential truth of the siege, that the greatest heroism often lies not in aggressive glory, but in the resilient, selfless will to protect the person next to you, to become a shield so that others may live. In the end, William Carter did not see himself as a legend. He was simply a soldier from Bastogne, and that, in its quiet, unyielding fortitude, was enough to etch his spirit permanently into the frozen ground of history.